Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchek, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchek Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. Hello and welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, where I'm very excited to be sitting down with my fellow running coach and friend, Elisabeth Scott, who is here from runningexplained.com, who is sitting down with me for a chat today about how we translate science and running-based research into working with your kind of everyday recreational type of athlete. So I thought that a conversation with Elisabeth was a perfect person to bring on to have this discussion for this episode, and I'm really excited for our conversation today. So thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join me.
Well, thanks for having me, Steph. I know it's been a while since we talked, and when you invited me back, I was like, absolutely, heck yes. So yeah, one of my first podcast interviews back since we moved. So I'm excited to get back into it.
Yeah,
see what I still know.
yeah. Let's get the wheels turning again. So yeah, speaking of that, I mean, the last time that we sat down and recorded a podcast together, I mean, I don't even think that I was pregnant yet. So, I mean, since then, lots has changed on my end. But yeah, give us an update on you and your life and your business and what's new over at Running Explained and all the things.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, has it really been that long? I think that the last time we talked was, I think, like right before you found out about the twins. So
Yeah.
congratulations. I know they're
Thank you.
almost mobile at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, 2024 Running Explained. I'm really excited. My husband got a new job, so we moved to a different state, which has consumed most of my year so far. But being in that state of flux and experiencing firsthand the things that I always talk about, like stress is stress, be mindful of total stress overload and all these things that influence your, not just your athletic performance, but your daily functioning, experiencing that firsthand and really going through it and being like, yeah, this is a really stressful time. I'm not running very much and I'm okay with that. I think it's been a really good experience. I think if this had happened, if we'd done this big move maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I probably would not have given myself as much grace and tried to do some sort of weird, bizarre, big training commitment through it, and then really would have gotten into trouble. So anyways, yeah, no,
You have
I'm
a stress
back.
fracture
We're
right now
back.
or something.
Right, exactly. Like, let's not, let's try to avoid all the big things. So I'm excited. Big things coming up for the company. We're expanding our one-on-one coaching program, continuing with our group coaching, training plans, lots coming down the pipeline. So I'm very excited about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. So on that note, working as a running coach, I mean, so much of what we do is looking at science and looking at research on running and like our development of training plans and how to coach someone and deciding what workout goes where and how many miles a week someone should run and all that wonderful stuff. It's got to come from somewhere, right? And so where do you get, or what are some of your favorite resources for that type of running information? Where's your favorite places to go?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I love the conversation about coaching and run coaching. And for me, when I think about coaching, there's really two facets to what coaching is. One is the actual what's going on the calendar. How do we write effective programming? Like, how do we make sure that we are structuring somebody's training days and weeks and months and years in a way that is going to help them reach their goals and keep them healthy in the process? Like, that's like one side of it. So, that kind of coach, information, education, that's, I would say, it's pretty widely available, but obviously I think we're going to dive into more of this stuff. Some of my favorite resources, I took a couple of running certification programs. I think those types of programs are a great jumping off point if you are new to the concept of endurance sport, specifically running and how the basics of this sport works. Some of my other favorite resources, of course, are not just reading the ongoing research that we have in our field, but, standing on the shoulders of those who've already written a ton of, massive educational tomes about it. So, Steve Magnus's The Science of Running is a great book I always reference. The Lore of Running by Tim Noakes, although some of his recent personal views I find bizarre. His running knowledge is pretty solid, right? And then The books that a lot of the coaches that we reference in this space as people who are like, yeah, oh, the Jack Daniels and the Pete Fitzinger and the Hanson's marathon method, those kind of staples of endurance training. It's always good to read that kind of thing. But yes, you're right. There's always, the new stuff that's coming out too. So I do like to keep on top of the research.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, like you were saying, there's sort of the two facets to coaching. And, I think that like for all of us, one of those will come more easily than the other. I don't know if you would sort of agree with that, but I feel like some of us are like very natural coaches in sort of the empathy part of it and the conversational part of it and the relating to people and like helping them through those tough moments and like that piece of coaching. And whereas other people are probably much better at writing good plans and programs and maybe less so at like the human aspect of coaching. And everyone always has work to do in sort of both areas of it, but I think as a coach, just like figuring out where you need the most work and most effort and being able to put your attention there.
Yeah, that's true. Part of being a coach is not just about writing, quote unquote, the perfect program, because it doesn't exist, right? There's no
Yeah.
such thing as a perfect program. But it is, for me, a lot of what coaching is listening to what my clients don't say and, reading between the lines. When I was a newer coach, I was very into, and I thought, well, if I just write the programs based on these principles and I'm following the science and this is how we structure our weeks, like it'll be fine. People will say, oh, cool, it's so science based, and and buy in and be fine with it. But I quickly came to realize that there is so much about how we work with our athletes and how we program certain things and make certain decisions about what we put on somebody's calendar or don't put on our calendar that is also the process and act of coaching, right? So, depending on the person I'm working with, there's been times when I've structured somebody's training week or given them a workout, which technically wouldn't seem like it would fit in a tradition like a pre-written plan, or may seem a little bit like, oh, that's interesting, why are we doing that in this training? But it was for a purpose, right? It was a learning opportunity, or it was an experience for them, or it was like a trust building exercise for both of us in terms of getting them to buy into the program or kind of introducing somebody to new concepts. So there's so many ways to take the kind of the foundational components of how to program somebody's schedule and then apply it to the real human aspect.
Well, yeah. And I think that, like, so many, I've seen, conversations amongst coaches and stuff like that where people are feeling a little bit like concerned or worried or nervous about some of the, you know, popular like running apps and online sort of things that provide a program, provide a plan. I mean, and realistically, like this stuff has always been there. Like there's always been places that you can go to like download a PDF or like there's always been places you can buy a book and get tons of running plans pre-made and stuff like that from a book. And the value of like coaching is the modifications. It's the helping you through those barriers and those challenges and those tough points, understanding how to modify things if and when you need to. Like there's so much more to it than just being a person who writes a training plan, even though having a good quality training plan is an important part of working with the right coach.
Yeah, no, that's huge. And, it's not like what we're doing is some sort of mystic, esoteric, we're not like withholding information like the almighty run coach, and the only one who knows how to program your schedule. I'll be honest with you, by and large, I think many of the people that I work with and that come to Running Explain for one-on-one coaching could technically be completely okay following a pre-written training plan or following one of the pre-written plans that I do offer for download, right? And nobody's budgets for one-on-one coaching. Nobody cares to do one-on-one coaching if they want a really good quality plan. And so a lot of times people they would be able to achieve their goal following a pre-written plan, but that's not what coaching necessarily is. Now, some people truly have the craziest lives and like no pre-written plan would ever follow, and get anywhere near close to, what they actually need in their training weeks. But, a lot of what the coaching is, like you said, it is that listening to, responding to, modifying, tweaking, but also so much of it is helping an athlete gain trust in their own abilities more than anything else. So that's to have a coach who I think can guide you along the path of helping you build that trust within yourself. That's really, really hard to cultivate on your own. And so that's, I think, one of the huge parts that the benefit of working with a coach, what that offers, as well as I think somebody to objectively help you understand what's going on rather than you subjectively thinking that you always need to do more, go faster, go harder. Because by and large, runners, we tend to be pretty like type A, all in, more, more, more. And so a lot of what coaching is not just, it's like not holding somebody back, but like helping them be manage their training load correctly so that we can be consistent in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of made me think like not everyone too necessarily has that community of like supportive people in their lives. And also, your coach can be someone who really is that like support person to kind of cheer you on and make you feel good. And sometimes I find that my clients, whether we're talking nutrition, talking running, whatever it might be, just like they don't get a lot of opportunities to sort of have the spotlight on them. Like, just we're going to sit here for like half an hour or an hour and we're just going to talk about you and like what you're feeling and what you need and what's going well and solve your problems. And for a lot of like really sort of busy people who have a ton of other obligations or like, work in very giving professions, stuff like that, how often do you get that chance to just sit and talk about yourself?
Yeah, or to have somebody look at you and say, "Oh my gosh, you have a lot going on in your life right now. No
Yeah.
wonder you're feeling a little bit, under pressure." And again, it comes back to that the expectations that we have for ourselves and what and again, I fall into this too where I think, I expect I have unrealistic expectations for what I can and cannot do. But I think a lot of us are like that, not because we're delusional, but because we are excited, right? Because we're competitive and we are, want to kind of reach that next level, whatever that means for us. But at the same time, a lot of the things and this, of course, as a dietitian, that things that have to do with our bodies take a lot longer than I think we necessarily want them to.
Yep.
So, oh, it's been 3 weeks. Why have I not achieved my goal yet? Well, I ate an apple yesterday. Why am I not fixed?
Yeah.
Having a coach to not just put things in perspective, but also like support you along the way and say, hey, look, I know this is probably taking longer than you wanted. Or like, hey, look, here are all the things you've accomplished in the past 2 weeks, even if those are not things that you were necessarily focused on. Helping somebody celebrate the wins that they would completely ignore is a huge part of that.
Oh, totally, totally. So, on that sort of note, I'll say the wisdom and the art of coaching kind of being one thing that I think there's lots of good resources on, and you just kind of have to find the things that like work with you and work with your clients. But I think the science part of like building effective training programs, understanding physiology and all that kind of stuff, for a lot of us who coach recreational kind of everyday runners, I mean, some of them are faster, some of them are slower, some of them are running longer, some of them less so. Most of the research is not done on those people. And I don't know if a lot of coaches know that. Like, I don't know if that's really common knowledge outside of just like some circles. And this is 100% the case for both, athletic exercise science research as well as nutrition research. Um, we in say nutrition, like we're very careful and mindful of the fact that like something done in an animal model or done on a different population does not translate very well to the person that we might be talking to or might be sitting in front of. And I feel like in the nutrition space, we're like very cognizant of that fact. But in exercise science, I just feel like less so. And I don't know if that's kind of your perspective as well, or just because I come from nutrition and not exercise science, that's just a little bit of like my own sort of background. But do you feel like coaches are kind of taught that during our education, some of those shortcomings of the research, or like, what are your thoughts on that whole area?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I love that you point that out. Because that's, I would say, one of my big issues that I have with the way that a lot of science based, not just running or nutrition, but like in general, the way that science is communicated to the general population these days is that you will have somebody take like a study that they did in like rat cells and then write a headline about it, about how it applies to you, the human being, and like make a definitive claim. And it's like, that's so not that's not how it works, right? I can't
Yeah.
say like, well, in rat cells it did this, so therefore I should always do this. Like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And you're right, a lot of the research that's done on endurance sport is typically done in collegiate populations, because they are there already at many of these universities that conducts a lot of the research around this. They are available in teams, but that means they're young, right? We're already selecting in that group for a specific type of, hey, you're running in college. That already says something about you. And this, by and large, those studies tended to be done on men, not women. That is changing. I think the kind of age-old question of how do we do research that is truly representative of the populations that your niche and my niche and our niches are always working with, like that's just research is tricky to conduct in that way. But yeah, here's the thing though, we're all human beings, right? You don't stop being a human being. So even if we do have research that is conducted on a specific type of population, it's not like you are a silicon-based life form and it doesn't apply to you at all, right? So I think it's understanding that what are the principles here? What is going to be most applicable to the people that we are working with? What is, I would say, what evidence is more robust than others. And my favorite kind of end point of all of this is, does this matter to me and the people I'm working with, right? Is this something that is vitally important for us to, blah, blah, blah. And I think we get into a lot of that. We talk about things like the interference effect, right? The interference effect between building muscle and improving your cardiovascular exercise endurance. The whole like, oh, if you are a bodybuilder, you want to grow muscle, you can't do cardio, it'll kill your gains. Like, well, technically, yeah. But for the majority of people, does that matter for the people we work with? No, we want them to strength train and run, right? Or for people, so there's all these things where it's like, yeah, they may have done a study that said this, or this kind of body of research indicates that. But at the end of the day, is this something that you necessarily need to be cognizant of? And the answer to some of those questions is no.
Yeah, and like on that specific one, the interference effect, like the average person has tremendous capacity to still build muscle mass, whereas you take a bodybuilding population where they are already at, optimal, they've been strength training for years and years and years and years. Like for them to get that extra like 1% is going to be a tremendous amount of effort. They're going to do everything they can to get that 1%. Whereas for most of us, just simply doing 20 minutes 3 times a week is like, is going to get us the gains. And I feel very similarly about the research around protein and how much protein we should be eating in a day, because you see very similar studies that make a lot of headlines, research coming out talking about, the value of adding, being at 2 grams per kilo, 2.5 grams per kilo, 3 grams per kilo, your body weight in protein per day. I know, I can see your face. Like, yes, it is a tremendous amount of protein. And these research studies, are done on these small populations, whatever, and they find that there is benefit, whatever that might be, whether it's body composition changes, whether it's like appetite suppression for body weight control, like whatever it is, they say, yeah, you know what, this works. Well, that's fine. But are you really going to eat 3 grams per kilo body weight per day in protein, like for longer than, I think I would make it, I don't even know if I'd make it 24 hours, but like, are you really going to do that? So yes, maybe we have this research that said that this thing is effective or this thing works, again, in a specific population that it was studied on, but are you going to do that? And if the answer is no, especially not long-term, then I really don't care.
And the other thing too, is when we're looking at research, evaluating the quality of the research, and scientific literacy, I think is really important. But at the same time, that point you bring up where, for a couple people, would this be ideal for them? Yes. But for a lot of people, it's not, even if it were to provide a benefit, it's not realistic for their lifestyle or what they have availability to do in their life. And then kind of the other part of all of this is that rarely do you have research that, even if it, comes to the findings are that there is a relationship between these things, there are going to be people for whom maybe that is not as effective, right? And that comes the individualization part of all of this. And I know one of the things you want to talk about is kind of these running rules, quote unquote, that we are thrown around in the running community a lot of the time. And, the individualization aspect is so important, because yes, we are human beings, and by and large the same things work for everybody, but just kind of manipulate the how much and the when and the where and the why. But everybody is also going to be really different. So even if I'm working with 3 people who are 3 people of the same age, same roughly their fitness level and, saying they're all men or they're all women, they're, kind of all the same, I would not still train them the same way. Like, it would probably be similar, right? They'd all look at each other's training plans and go, okay, I'm doing something similar to that this weekend. But it would all still be a little bit different because they're individual people.
Absolutely. And so, talking about kind of how we're taking what's out there and even what is has become like the fundamentals of running and the fundamentals of exercise science and stuff like that, things that you find in books, find in a lot of these resources, find in a lot of like the go-to stuff that's really become the fabric of what we do as running coaches, and kind of look beyond that to the quality or sometimes even the amount of research that's actually been done on some of these things. But it just goes so far back in our history that we kind of just accept it because it's just been passed down for, generations and generations. What are some of the frustrating things that you run into when you're trying to be as evidence-based as possible, but there's just, when you go digging, you find that there really is just a remarkable lack of research on some of these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because there are a handful of these things where in the running community, we accept them as fact and quote unquote settled science, which is not a phrase that actually exists. Like, no science is ever settled. And then when you go looking and say, well, I wonder where this came from, it kind of leads into this weird, like, wait, there's just kind of nothing here. And so one of those is, it's not quite like this, but that the 3 hour cap your long runs at 3 hours.
Yeah.
Right. That's a really, really big one. Now, here's the thing. I'm not against people being mindful of how long their longest long runs are in the context of their training. If you are running, 30 minutes twice a week and then 5 hours on the weekends for one single long run, like, no, you're gonna have I'm gonna have a problem with that. Like, that's incredibly unbalanced. Having people spend way too much time on feet in the context of their overall training load, like, those things matter. However, the cap your long runs at 3 hours thing came about because Dr. Jack Daniels, one of the, kind of granddaddies of endurance, not recreational because he worked with elite runners, but endurance running, the people he was working with were by and large didn't need to run more than 3 hours. So we didn't really have to run more than 3 hours because even as marathoners were finishing under 3 hours. And then the research about that was, I think, done on rats back in like the 70s. And I would have to pull it up specifically. But if you actually dig into, hey, what research specifically indicated that we should limit our longest long runs to 3 hours so we can prevent, overtraining and risk of injury, that sort of thing, there isn't any research that says that or indicates that at all. Now, again, it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad place to start. And I think a lot of these kind of, common knowledge guidelines are a good jumping off point, but they are not going to be rules in the way that we typically think of them as rules that govern like physics or chemistry or biology. Like, they're more recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because sometimes I'll see people who are, say, training for like an ultra run, and their question or their concern will be, well, I mean, I'm training for this ultra marathon, and like I keep seeing that my longest long run shouldn't be more than 3 hours. So like, that seems crazy because I'm training for ultra. It's like, yeah. No, that would be probably a bad idea as an ultra runner. Like, you're going to have to be running more than 3 hours on a pretty routine basis if you're going to run an ultra marathon.
Yeah.
And I mean,
like,
and
think about the thing you're training for. If it's gonna take you 12 hours to do it, you should probably run for longer than 3 hours for the longest long run.
yeah, absolutely. Now, you need to, for people who are listening to this, you need to work up to that for many, many, many months, if not years. We're not saying that you're just going to run for 12 hours after doing 2 30-minute runs in a week. But, and two, you have to think about, like, it's not just a matter of like what you can study, because we could all come up with a research question to say, okay, I would love to design a study to answer this question. You also have to have these people who are willing to subject themselves to whatever study it is that you're doing. So in the concept of doing research, say on the optimal length of a long run for professional competitive athletes. Well, they're not going to want to do a lot of stuff that potentially detracts from their ability to perform well. So if we have a pretty good sense that you don't need to run a lot longer on any single run than the length of time you're going to be running on the day of your race, to take the risk of say, okay, we're going to take these collegiate athletes and we're going to make them go run for 4, 5, 6 hours or whatever to see what happens to them in their event. Well, as a competitive athlete, like you're not signing up for that.
No, and like the ethical component of this is huge as well whenever you work with people on this. And it is the rise of digital, Strava and Garmin and all of these applications that you upload your data to and it's stored in their databases. It doesn't go away. Like, they're probably using it for something to probably sell you something. But the cool thing about that is that we're seeing a lot more research coming out that looks at these huge data sets of people uploading information into, Strava actually, there are a couple of recent studies that were done where on these massive data sets from Strava, looking at marathon specifically, right? Because it's so hard to study marathon stuff, especially with large populations, because again, like how do you get all those people together and get them to do this stuff and then control it and all the variables? So although looking at these large data sets after the fact is like in a perfect world, yes, we would design the studies perfectly, but we have to, use what we're given. But having these data sets available now, I think is really going to provide more insight into some of these, especially recreational runner adjacent topics and questions than just looking at research that is done on these smaller groups. Because, sample sizes for most things when it comes to running specifically, but like this endurance exercise are quite small. Like I've read a ton of research with, sample sizes that were like well under 20 people,
Oh, yeah.
you like 9, 11 people, 12 people, 19 people, and 4 of them dropped out. So, yeah. So there's, there's really cool stuff coming out. But again, it's adding to what we know. I don't know that I've actually read anything in research in the past decade or two that's totally changed the way we think about everything. It's more about refining what we thought already and maybe providing insight or clarity on some certain things.
Yeah, and just always looking at those sort of parallels to what we know in nutrition science. Like you said, like 20 people, and some of these are like landmark studies that were done on like 20 people. But what I find, like, we know about the basic structure of, say, healthy eating, for example. Yes, we can argue the finer points, and I do that every single week on this podcast. But what we knew or suspected 60, 70 years ago about like what a healthy balanced diet looks like has not really changed a whole heck of a lot. Now, that for some people, they may see that as like a huge shortcoming and a huge downfall. But what I find the research has really shown us over the years is not necessarily a big shift in what a healthy diet, what the foundation of a basic healthy diet looks like, but understanding the why. Like uncovering like, okay, well, what do these foods have that are beneficial for us? Why does a specific dietary pattern have benefits over a different dietary pattern? Like it's understanding like those sort of answers rather than it giving us a big like dramatic 180 in how we think about healthy eating overall.
Which, despite what journalists and headlines would have you believe, where it's this is terrible.
Know what we're talking about.
Yeah. Oh my God. But also like this will kill you. This will help you live forever. It's like no.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing, I think, a way to, as you were talking about that, something that made me a really good example, I think, in the running research is one of these studies that was done using a large data set from Strava about marathon tapers. And they looked at, I think it was mass. It was like tens of thousands, maybe not like 100,000. It was just this unbelievable, like, I was like, oh my God, all the data. Cool. And they looked at the weeks leading up to a marathon, and then they looked at marathon performance. And by and large, kind of the conclusion of this study was that obviously tapering improves performance, like as yes, thank you.
Yep. We
actually
know.
taping rather than like saying you're going to taper, but then like not tapering.
And like going to spin class every day instead of running.
Right, exactly. But the conclusion, or what they indicated in their findings, was that a 3-week taper seemed to be more beneficial for performance than a 2-week taper for marathon. Now, here's the thing. If I were to say, well, I am a coach who follows the science, so whatever the science says, like that's what I do because I trust the science. Now, here's the thing: there are a whole bunch of people for whom a 2-week taper is better. And there are a whole bunch of people, elite runners, who taper for their marathons for less than 2 weeks, right? So, yes, if by and large, a large data set indicated that a 3-week taper was most beneficial for your marathon performance and a 2-week taper was also beneficial, but slightly less beneficial, right? And I think that's okay, cool. So, tapering's important, somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks for most people. And then we figure out, all right, but for the individual, what do you prefer? How long was your training cycle? What have you done in the past and tapered? There have been athletes who we've gotten to the end of their marathon training cycle. We were planning on a 2-week taper. Stuff happened. They're like, hey, I'm feeling, pretty over it. Like, I'm like, cool, we'll just taper for 3 weeks now. Easy adjustment. I've had people who say, I usually taper for 3 weeks. Can you help me with adjust my training plan? Absolutely. And then of course, like I said, we do have elite or sub-elite athletes who would benefit from a 7-day taper or a 10-day taper. Like, so that's where the individualization and listening to your body and what your experience is and how things tend to work for you also is beneficial. So like, yes, like I said, it's the jumping off point, but it's not to say everybody should always taper for 3 weeks for their marathon for optimal performance. Like, no,
Yeah.
like that's not the case.
And if you're doing it different, you're wrong and stupid.
Right, exactly. That's the thing. Well, the science says this. I'm like, the science says a lot of things, okay?
Yeah. Well, and I'm horrendously bad at like remembering specific like names of scientists on studies and years and everything like that. But I mean, the prior sort of large study on tapering, I don't know what year it came out or anything like that, but I mean it said like anywhere from like 4 to 28 days was kind of like the good range. And it was like a meta-analysis, I think, that looked at kind of all the research. But I'm willing to bet that the vast, vast, vast majority of the studies that went into that meta-analysis, for people who are listening that aren't familiar, a meta-analysis is where they take like all the results of a whole bunch of different studies that have been done on a topic and kind of put all of them together and then come to conclusions. And so a meta-analysis is considered, a good quality study, provided there are good quality,
top quality,
provided there are good quality studies that have
Yes.
gone into making this meta-analysis, that always being the key point. So, I mean, like it does give us a little bit more to work with compared to saying, okay, between 4 and 28 days is pretty darn good. So to say, okay, 3 weeks for a marathon, that's definitely going to be helpful just to, again, give you a jumping off point. But like you said, it depends on the length of that training cycle, how it went. Do you have injuries that you're trying to kind of rehab so that you can actually get to the start line of that race healthy? You're better off doing a longer taper and actually being able to run the race that day versus a shorter taper, and then you don't have enough time to actually be recovered and ready to do that event.
Yeah, and that's huge. And that 4 to 28 days, I mean, I would say that is kind of the range of time one would taper for any endurance event, right?
Yes.
So it's like, are you running an endurance event and you would need to taper for it? Cool. Your taper is going to be anywhere between 4 and 28 days, depending on all of these variables.
Yeah.
And I've had runners who do a 3-week taper and tell me they feel flat on race day. And I've had runners who do a 2-week taper and say they didn't feel like they were recovered in time. So all of this, and also I think the tricky thing that most people don't like about all of this is that it can change from cycle to cycle. We as human beings, especially when we have these goals that we're trying to achieve, whether they're time-based or distance, or like, running a marathon, running a half marathon, right? These are all huge goals, no matter what your actual, end outcome, finish time might be. But that, it can change from cycle to cycle. So if you did a 2-week taper last time, you would expect, well, I'll do a 2-week taper this time and it'll probably work for you, but maybe your circumstances have changed, right? And so maybe a different taper length would be beneficial for you in this training cycle. But we don't like that. We want to be told exactly what to do so that we can achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And like, just tell me what to do. And so having
3 months in advance, I want to know exactly what this whole thing is going to look like.
I've had people come to me like, I want to plan out the next 18 months of my training. I'm like, cool. So we're going to write this in pencil, right? Because
Very
there's going to
lightly,
be a
very
lot that
lightly.
could change. But, I think this is where some people, come back and say, well, this worked last time, or like I did differently last time and it worked for me. Like, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And like as people who are guiding other people through this journey, and as a dietitian, I'm sure it's very much the same. Like we are making very educated kind of guesses about what we think is going to work best for you based
Yep.
on all of the things that we know about, the science and the process and about you, the individual. But there was always going to be room for maybe, we're going to try to nail it as much as we can, but there's always going to be a little like, yeah, maybe we should have done something a little bit differently, or maybe this wasn't optimal this time, right? So people hate that. They think I'm paying for a service. This person can tell me exactly what to do and I'll do it. And so, that's not how it works, unfortunately.
Yep.
But the most important thing I think for anyone who's listening is saying, okay, so like, what's the point of this? Is that through the process, this exploration of who we are as runners and how we respond to these different things, becoming a student of yourself, how you respond to all these things. Nobody else is you. Nobody else knows how you actually feel or how you actually think or how you actually work. So if you can amass this knowledge in yourself of the things that you have found work and don't work and your preferences, that is a huge asset to you in the journey of being a runner, whether you work with a coach or not.
Yeah, 100%. And I think too, like, getting really comfortable with that, like, introspection and reflecting and like, thoughts and feelings and stuff that you're kind of, you're kind of getting at here. I'm having a hard time sort of capturing it all very succinctly, but also communicating that, like,
Mm-hmm.
and if you're coaching yourself and you're making your own running plans or finding your own plans online and following them, or anything like that, getting it out of your head and like writing it down, making those notes, putting it somewhere that you can like reflect on it in a different type of way rather than just up in your own brain. But if you're working with a coach, to like communicate and just try to be as open with your communication as you can, because we don't live in your body, so we don't know how things feel, and nothing is worse than someone telling you after like a month of training, oh yeah, my hip's been bothering me. And it's like, oh, when did that start? Thinking this is the first time I've heard about it. It's like, oh, well, it's been like getting worse for like the last month or so. It's like,
I think, sometimes, and I'll be interested to see if you feel this way in the work you do as a dietitian. I think sometimes, actually, no, I know sometimes when you're working with a client, it's like they're afraid to disappoint you,
yes.
right? Like, but I'm not your teacher. I'm not your mom, right? Like we are in this together.
Yep.
That, I don't care if you had to bail on your workout. I don't care if you missed a run because you picked kids up. I don't care if you are feeling something in your knee. I would really like to know about it though, like so we
Yes.
can do something about it.
Yeah.
It's like this, I think some people sign up for coaching or even sign up for working with a dietitian as a way to hold them like for that accountability.
Oh,
Right.
yes.
Whereas like
What
that
a
motivation,
word. What a charged word,
right.
accountability.
If I'm paying somebody to tell me what to do, I'll be more likely to do it. So I'll also do exactly what they tell me to do no matter what, because then I'm winning at the thing that I'm doing.
Yeah.
I like to see the check mark between all, next to the box that I did today. And that's not what this is, right? If I am working with a client and they have no feedback or like, whatsoever, have like no questions or like are just doing things, first of all, that happens during some periods of working with the person, right? But if it's like that for months, like I'm going to have some like, hey, like kind of questions about, are we doing the right things, right? Is this really
Yep.
working for you, right? Because if I just tell you what to do and you do it, what are we learning?
Yep. Yeah. And I think
that's part of it. Like, please try to do the things that we suggest that you do. But
yes.
yeah,
Yes.
we want to hear what you think and how it's going.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, like sort of being on the flip side of that client practitioner relationship, just after having babies, working with my physiotherapist, kind of getting me back into running. I will say like it, and I get this, and now sort of being on the side of it, like I have a newfound sort of empathy for people who like, have an issue, and it's almost like if I ignore it and I don't give it any attention, it's gonna go away and then it's gonna be
Mm-hmm.
fine. But I am just here to tell you all listening, it's not gonna go away. it's not going to be fine. You have to tell us when you have a problem.
There's also a thing where, and I've seen this for, men and women that I work with, but especially for the women, I've heard, and being a woman myself, right? There is an element of, I don't want to bother them. Like, this isn't that big of a deal,
Okay.
right? Like,
Okay. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm sure it'll go away. I don't want to make a big fuss out of nothing,
Yeah.
right?
Or I don't want to be
And
told I
yeah.
can't run.
Yeah, that's another big one. Now, here's the thing is I've rarely, first of all, I'm not the one who can tell you whether you're not you're cleared to run. Like a physical therapist is the one who tells you that. But also, you know, I would so much rather we address it early. So we maybe have to take a couple days off rather than you being out for 3 months because it turned into a stress fracture. So these things where, more communication, yeah, it might seem superfluous or like unrelated, but there are things that matter to us that we should know about you. Like, yeah, your kid's sick. You were up all night and got 2 hours of sleep. Cool. Maybe we should move your workout. Right.
Yeah.
Like, there's something stressful going. You hate your job. Right. So you're trying to get out of it in that exit process. Like you were just, there are all these things in your life that influence how you are going to feel and respond to training. So whether or not you think it's that big of a deal, mention it anyways. And if it's not, like, we'll kind of file it away as like, okay, cool. I'll pull that out if I need to. But there are some things where it's like, oh, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. Thanks for bringing it up. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, on the topic of like, again, just sort of being that coach and that guide and sort of making those decisions. I mean, again, like just in the nutrition space, that's always what I fall back to when I'm thinking about this stuff is, we just call it like using your clinical judgment. And you take the research, understand the research, the pros and cons and what it can tell us and what it can't, and then look at the person sitting in front of you and what's going on with them. And you got to marry the two together and use your clinical judgment to make a decision. And this happens a lot. Like I actually found that it happened a lot when I was working as a clinical dietitian, like in a hospital setting, which is, I think, probably really surprising for a lot of people that in a lot of scenarios, when you've got a person like in a hospital bed in front of you, you don't have a whole bunch of research on this specific situation or scenario. So you're just having to do an assessment, look at what you do have, what you don't have, come up with a plan, and understanding that like you're going to monitor outcomes. The plan might need to change. Maybe it will be a good plan and it will work. Maybe it won't. You'll need to adjust. But there's no like fault or sort of judgment in those settings for when you need to make an adjustment. Like if you're using your best clinical judgment and you make a decision and this is what we're going to try to do, like everyone goes into it with the understanding that this is our best and we're going to just modify things as needed going forward. But I think sometimes like outside of that type of circle, there's almost a lot of like, well, it needs to be perfect the first time. And if it's not, you're bad at what you're doing. Like you're doing a bad job if you don't get it right the first time.
Yeah, and it's tough with running too because by and large we are tying our coaching relationships to race day outcomes, right?
Yes.
So, I've, having people judge their training cycle based on whether or not they achieve their race day goal.
Mm-hmm.
And even me reminding the clients that I work with, who've had tough race days that, in a lot of cases, like they had an incredible cycle and maybe they PR'd another race distance during their training cycle, but on the big day at the end of it, it didn't happen. And then, so kind of putting everything in context and saying like, if you were on your own, you might totally just beat yourself up and say, what a waste of time. I can't believe it. I suck. This sucked. Well, this was such, but saying like, no. Like, let's see what actually happened here. The other thing too, talking about, best, professional judgment is that, and I'll say this in a bad way, there are absolutely no legal requirements to what you need to know or not know in order to be called a quote unquote running coach. Right.
Or
So
a coach in general, or a nutritionist,
coach
by
in
the way, in a
general,
lot of places.
or a nutritionist, right? Like you can go take your, 45-minute nutrition class and call yourself nutritionist. And so, I think for me being highly aware that I have no formal degree in any sort of, I do not have a master's in exercise science, although I would love to go get one because I think it'd be super fun. I'm not a dietitian. There is no, board certification requirements. There are no licensing requirements for somebody to be a running coach. that's just, you have to be very careful about, I think, where you're getting your education and information from. I've had people come to me who've worked with, other run coaches in the past, and they showed me what they're doing. And it's like, what is this? Like, who would program this for you? Somebody who doesn't know anything about science or the sport or like endurance, like at all. Like, did they ever read a book? Like, this is so, far beyond what anybody would normally program. And then, so yeah, that's kind of something I think it's very important to remember. Now, it's not to say you can't be a really effective coach without, going and getting a higher education degree in that. But it's something I think to be very cognizant of. Asking somebody, where do you get your information? Like, where is your education in general? Do you like to keep up on the current research? And then also, I think what you're trying to get out of the relationship. I think, like you said, some coaches are really, really good at one facet and not so great at the other. So if you have somebody who's really wonderful, empathetic, warm, supports you emotionally, you trust them a lot, and at looking kind of back on it, you think, well, their programming wasn't necessarily that sophisticated, but I trusted them and I learned a lot, and it was good for my journey. That's fine. You can also have people who are very clinical, will write programs based on the research and their best judgment, but have the, bedside manner of a toilet. So, like it all kind of depends. So,
Yeah.
what I wanted to kind of say about all this is that, the relationship and kind of how much you trust your coach, trust yourself as well. If your coach is asking you to do something or telling you to do something that you think feels or looks a little weird, like, that seems a little unusual, or like, I've never heard of anybody do that, or what they're telling me to do, I heard somebody else say don't do that. Ask them why you're doing it, right?
Yes.
Ask them, what is the purpose? What is the point? What is not the justification, but like, hey, I want to know, like, this is unusual. Tell me more about why this is on my schedule or why we're doing it this way. Somebody who is programming with the whole context in mind will have a reason, right? We'll have say, yeah, we're doing it this way and it looks weird because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, okay, right? And if they don't have an explanation, then yeah, go from there.
Yeah, exactly. Again, the communication, right? That communication is just so key. And if you're working with someone who doesn't make you feel like you can communicate, can ask questions, whatever, then maybe this isn't a good person for you to be working with if you have questions that you're not getting answers to or don't feel comfortable asking. Yeah, so we try to look at the evidence and look at the science and read lots of books and everything like that. But the reality is that, like, most of these, even just these books that we're reading by running coaches, whether they're people who really advanced our field or people who just are, really good coaches that have a lot of great info to put out there for the rest of us to benefit from. One of the recent ones that I just finished reading was Mark Coogan, his book. And I really enjoyed, like, just his philosophy around coach. Like, I felt like I wanted to, like, hang out with him. Like, he just seemed like such, like, a nice guy in this in this book. But anyway, we read this, but again, he coaches professional runners. So at the back of a lot of these books, what you'll find in a lot of these resources is great resources even for us as coaches to kind of just, like, see what they're doing with their training and kind of how they put programs together. But ultimately, we're looking at programs and plans made for and meant for much higher level, much higher volume runners than the people that we would be coaching. So again, we're having to then kind of filter that into the person that we're working with. So what are some of your, I'll say, sort of techniques or strategies or things that you do to kind of take, like, that information that you get and some of those things and then kind of cater it to the population that you might be working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's so much that we can learn from those people. One of the books that was really influential, two books that were really influential to me early on in my running career were Pete Fitzinger's books, Advanced Marathoning and Faster Road Racing. Books that are designed entirely for people running a minimum of 45 to 50 miles per week, and usually much more in many situations.
Yeah. I think this one, it says, like, if you're running 50 to 70 miles a week is, like, one of the ones.
Yeah, like, Fitz is, his the lowest level marathon training plan he offers, like, is 50, goes up to 55 miles per week, which for a lot of people is not something they'd ever run in any week. Now, there are a handful, and I've worked with them, I've been there myself. Yeah, there are people who totally can run that and much more, 70, 80, 90. I've never worked with a recreational runner who runs 100 miles a week, but
That's
that's
a
a lot.
full-time job.
But
I'm
yeah,
sorry. I don't care who you are, it's a full-time job.
what I think is really interesting is, looking at these programs. So here's the thing, you know, the more that you run, right, the more capacity you have to do the fancy stuff. And this is why people who run 60, 70, 80, 90 miles per week can do all these different things in their week because they have so many sessions, right? So if I'm running 70 miles per week, I am not currently, not even close, but if I were, and I have in the past, if I were, it'd probably be over 6 days of running per week. And in that, I would have probably 2 workouts, easy runs, and then a long run, which may or may not also be a workout. Now, for 6 days of running, and for 3 of those days to be, quality sessions, so that's not easy, right? Moderate or high intensity, and then a long run, which even though if it's done in your easy effort zone, is still a more taxing session because of its duration, whether or not you add in any workout into that long run. That is a lot of intensity for most people. Two workouts and a long run, which may or not be a workout in your training week. For most people, that's too much, right? But what are we trying to accomplish in that week? What are the physiological, adaptations that we're targeting? How can we do something similar to what that week is doing in somebody who's running 30 miles per week? Can we, right? Do we have the bandwidth for what their goal that they're trying to achieve is? So, what are the systems that we're trying to improve? Where is this athlete starting from? What are their strengths and weaknesses? Like this all matters. So, where I've really boiled it down to is that the fancier it is, the more I think gets lost in the noise. Any coach will tell you that there's really, yeah, there are infinite ways to program things, but there's not that many different things that we would do. So if you work with me or another coach on my team, and we both are training you for a marathon, our programming might look pretty similar because there's only so many ways to program in a marathon pace workout in the middle of the week, or to program in lactate threshold, or to program in 5K pace repeats. There's only so many ways we can put that into your schedule. But the big things that we want to be cognizant of is, where do those things fall within your week, right? What is the context of the rest of your week and what we're trying to improve? How big is that thing, right? So if, like I said, if you're running 30 miles per week, I'm not going to have you go run 22 miles with, 12 a marathon pace. That's huge. That's majority of your weekly mileage. That's crazy. But how could we scale a workout that would be appropriate for where you are? So all these things, right? So you kind of think of the stuff that really high volume, high level athletes are doing as kind of like the fanciest, top level version. And how can we scale those down or apply some of the similar training principles to athletes who are running considerably less than that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that you know, looking at, for me, specifically, the volume sort of being the first thing, what's the volume that person is actually running, and kind of scaling down everything in terms of volume. But then, like you had mentioned, and we sort of talked about this a little bit earlier with the 3 hour long run, and is that kind of something we want to take as a hard and fast rule or not, keep it flexible, adjusting these other common variables and other common sort of rules that we have incorporated to the capacity and to the skill level and to the goals of the person that we do happen to be working with. So, we talk about some of these running rules that have been created and get tossed around all the time. And a lot of us who make social media content, use some of these things because they're very sort of convenient and kind of easy to sort of say in a post, and they can be attention grabbing for people who aren't really familiar with them. And I think that it's one of the benefits of social media, but also one of the drawbacks, that sometimes there's so much nuance that's lost when you have 5 seconds to catch and hold someone's attention. But things like the 80-20 rule, the 10% rule in terms of increasing volume. We talked about the 3 hour long run, but also having your long run not be more than 30% of your total week meal. Some of these things were really created under the science done on these primarily young elite or sub-elite kind of college level athletes. And so, do you find that you prefer to hold sort of, I'll say those, I don't want to call them rules, but those sort of guidelines, we hold those steady, and then we're scaling up, scaling down volume, intensity, whatever, based on that person? Or do you find that it's better to have flexibility with those guidelines as a strategy for adapting things for the recreational population?
Yeah, that's a good question. And they are truly guidelines. They are, like I said before, jumping off points. And something actually before we move on to this, something I forgot to mention about the, higher volume plans you might read in the back of somebody, like advanced marathoning, is that even though they're distance based, they're written for athletes who are probably pretty fast.
That,
So I
yes.
remember when
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so if we're doing, go run 6 miles at lactate threshold, cool. What's your lactate threshold pace? Because if it's faster than 7 minutes, then you're going to be spending over 35 minutes running at lactate threshold, which is a gigantic lactate threshold workout for almost everybody.
Yeah.
So it's like the context of that matters. Not people say, well, why, you know, distance versus time. You can have somebody who's running 100 miles per week spend the same amount of hours per week running as somebody who's running 50 miles per week because they're literally twice as fast, right? So like that, it's not just about distance, it is about duration and time on feet, right? So I think it's something really,
100%.
really, really important to mention when we are comparing, or investigating what a higher volume athlete might be doing and seeing how we could scale that down, not just about distance, but about primarily duration. But yeah, no,
100%.
these other things are really good guidelines and jumping off points. Actually, I've done a lot of posts about the quote unquote 10% rule. Again, I think that it is a reasonable guideline to help prevent people increasing, gigantic, week over week. I've seen people send me the craziest stuff where 1 week they were running, 5 miles, and then the next it was 6 miles, and the next it was 7 miles, and the next it was 8 miles, and it was time. It was just like every week I was like, oh my God, like when are you going to stop? Like you're going to double your volume in 3 weeks. Like, what are you doing? But at the same time, for lower volume runners, right? If you're running 5 miles per week and you add 10%, that's 5.5 miles. It's going to take you forever to scale up, right? So context matters. Why are you increasing? So that's the 10% rule, 10% guideline. I have not to say less of a problem with. I think it's a pretty simple one to just be like, yeah, it's a really good suggestion. Context matters.
Stops you from
Just be
doubling your
mindful.
mileage every week. Yeah.
Right.
When I'm
go ahead.
I was going to say, when I'm putting a plan together, it's kind of like, I like that the program I use for building training plans, like it adds up the total miles that I've put in week by week. And it's kind of like my last little like pre-flight check.
Yeah.
It's like, I just, kind of look at them. I'm like, okay, yeah, I like that. I don't use the mileage and then break that down to make it, like it's the making sure I haven't done anything like crazy versus the, okay, I'm going to like increase the volume and then break that down into the workouts. And if, it's like pretty darn close to 10%, then we're happy. So definitely a guideline. But yeah, as a rule, I would say very, very loose.
And also not just about, like you said, your, weekly volume, but any one single run, right? So if I go from, let's say I'm running 25 miles in a week with a 10-mile long run, and the next week I'm running 30 miles with a 15-mile long run. Whoa, that one run, that was a huge increase to one single day, right? So it's not just about the total at the end of the week, but about how you allocate those increases throughout the week as well. Which is, it always trips me up when I go, when we add a day, right? So let's say we're doing 4 days per week, and then we take a down week, and then we're coming back to 5 days per week. And I always have to be like, oh my God, no, we added a day. We're good. We're good.
Where'd these extra 6 miles come from?
Like it went up so much. Yeah. No, we're fine. The 80-20 thing is interesting. My relationship with the 80-20 principle has changed a lot. Matt Fitzgerald's book, 80-20 Running, is what really launched me onto this journey of my career today, being a professional and full-time run coach. And so the importance of easy running in general, like I cannot overstate how important it is to you, everybody who's listening. Easy running is really important to you as a runner, but also has been influential to me, like, doing what I do today. But at the same time, there's so much misunderstanding about 80-20. Like there is just, this could be a whole podcast episode, but a lot of the, the things that we think about with 80-20 in terms of a guideline, people like to apply that to every single week in their training year and like say, well, 80% of my runs are easy and 20% are hard every single week. That's not how it works, right? What we're looking at when we look at the research that is done that supports, this kind of what's called training intensity distribution, which is how you distribute your intensity throughout your training week, how much time you spend in a moderate versus a low versus a high intensity zone, that should fluctuate throughout your year. Not every single training cycle will be exactly 80-20 every single week. Base building is going to be mostly easy running. I mean, 95, 99% easy running. If you're in peak week training for a half marathon, your final couple weeks might be more like 60-40, right? 40% moderate or high intensity, because you got to get your last minute, your big workouts in towards the end of your training cycle. So the nuance of that and how your training intensity distribution should change throughout your training cycles in your year, that I think there's no nuance around that. And we talk about 80-20. And the other big thing that I think people misunderstand about 80-20 is not that it's 80% low intensity, 20% high intensity. It actually is 80% low intensity, 20% everything else, which includes your moderate and high intensity stuff. So, if you're saying, well, when am I supposed to get my marathon pace working with an 80-20 thing? Well, it's like, it's not. The marathon pace work is part of your quote unquote 20%, or part of that, the stuff that you're doing is not easy, which in marathon training could be more of a pyramidal distribution, which would be like 75% easy, like 20% moderate, 5% hard. Yeah. So this is where the fun part is, I think, for coaches, is that we kind of think about the principles of all of this stuff, and then not only how it applies to the runner in front of us, but to the runner in front of us in this specific period of their life in this week in their training cycle. So yeah, so these are all, like I said, they're good guidelines. But the 80-20 thing, I think we need to stop holding it up as some sort of golden rule. It's not. And hey, I'm all for people spending a lot of time in their easy effort zone. I really, really want you to spend a lot of time in your easy effort zone, but doggedly adhering to 80-20 as like it's carved in stone. I always have to be 80% easy, 20% hard every week. That's not how it's supposed to work.
Yeah. And I think that like the big takeaway is that you just need to spend more time running more slowly. And like most people are running too fast too often and trying to maintain, say, every workout at least marathon goal pace or fat. Like people are just sort of trying to do too much. We need to scale back a little bit. But like from a program design perspective, and maybe you do things a little bit differently, but for me, when I'm sitting down actually like designing a program, like I'm not thinking, like I'm not sitting there like calculating the weekly miles and seeing, okay, well, have what percent, like it's not something that I as a coach, and maybe there are people who do it this way, but like for me as a coach, like I'm not sitting there with that in my mind as I'm like designing a plan, because it's a guideline that I think really emphasizes the importance of the aerobic zone and of spending that time building that aerobic base, but isn't really like a prescription for exactly how each week should sort of pan out in terms of miles and distribution. And like just one kind of final point on that, we look at something like a speed session, right? If we want to add more volume to that runner's week, but they don't have maybe like a ton of other space to do that, well, maybe we're going to tack on a few easy miles before or after that person's speed session. Now, that whole day is considered a hard day, and the workout is a hard workout, even though there are a chunk of maybe easy miles at the beginning or at the end. So it's not now that day is no longer a hard day, or that those couple of miles are taking away from that 20%. Like it just starts to get a little messy when I think you like take it too literally or try to think too much about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think people literally think it's, if I'm running, I'm going to use a round number because I can't math that well. If I'm running 100 miles in a week,
on podcast.
80 of those specific miles need to be easy, and 20% of those specific miles need to be hard, or hard, moderate intensity. And that's not true. It is, there's actually a really great big study that was done looking at it. It's a recent last year or two. And it's, the full text is available. I love when studies offer full text for free, so I don't have to pay for journal access. The characteristics of elite distance runners.
And one of the things you make friends that work at universities, and then you just send them an email and say, hey, can you send me this study?
I was using, my cousin was getting her master's, and I was like, hey, can I use your university login for like PubMed access, please? Like,
I don't know. Yeah. Should we be like putting this, like they're going to come after us? Maybe we shouldn't be telling people we do
big
this.
journal's going to come get us.
Wouldn't surprise me.
So the full text is available. Actually, there's more research that seems to be offering free full text links, which is nice. But anyway, so it looked at characteristics of elite distance runners, and kind of training characteristics. And so one of the things it looked at, which I thought was really cool and validating for me to read, was that if you basically took their training intensity distribution throughout the year, it averaged roughly 80/20.
That's
But in their
interesting.
individual training cycles and in their individual training mesocycles, the distribution was all over the place, right? So you'd have people, peaking for, half marathon or a 10K, and yeah, it'd be like 50-50. But it is session intensity. So target session intensity. So you're right. If I go do track workout, but I add an extra 2 miles on before, I'm not sitting there going, okay, so I did 2 miles easy and I did 2.5 miles at 5K. So I have 2 miles for my easy bank and I have 2.5 miles. No, like the whole day's a hard day, right?
Yeah.
That whole day. So you do a tempo run one day, that whole day is a moderate day, right? So, and that's probably helps for you to communicate to your athletes about the athlete's play guideline as well, where it's like, I know you only did a couple miles at your race pace, but that's a hard work, yeah, and it's a hard day plate, or however you communicate. So yeah, it is session intensity, not specifically how much individual time did you spend in this intensity zone versus that one.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, those extra miles that you ran are still valuable in terms of the aerobic base that we're trying to build here. So we're not saying don't do those miles or like that they don't
Yeah.
count for anything. They're still very important. They're still there in your training program for a reason. Yeah. So I know that we're getting close to the end of our time here, even though I feel like our podcast episodes could like probably rival that of Joe Rogan, but we will not. So before we
Even
kind
though
of
our
wrap,
information is much better.
yes, and we have much better guests on talking about better things. I know we've gone through a lot of stuff here, but my last kind of question was, what are some of the major mistakes that you see, like either runners or like running coaches kind of making in regard to this conversation we've been having here today? So yeah, is there anything else that we haven't covered that kind of stand out to you as like big, I'll say red flags or sort of missteps?
Yeah, the programming one, that's a big one because it's like a spectrum of more optimal versus less optimal, right? Because you can do, and I'll talk about it worked for me, like, oh, but I did it this way and it quote unquote worked for me. Like, cool. Like, you don't know if something that different would have worked differently. That's not to say that what you did didn't work if you think it did, but it's also if you're doing something that is really kind of against the general recommendations of how we do program things, that doesn't necessarily mean that because it worked for you in that one instance that like everything else is wrong. And I see this all the time with easy effort running. People will say, well, I don't run anything in my easy zone, but I'm like, I just PR'd my race. I'm like, cool. That's great that you PR'd your race, but it doesn't mean that easy running is BS, right? It just means
Yeah.
that for you in the situation, you happen to train in a way that still got you the result you were looking for. Now, eventually, I guarantee you, I'll put money on this, you are going to burn out and you will come to me and we will be talking about easy running. And so that's kind of one big thing is saying, somebody's individual experience that was, not kind of what we would typically recommend in a programming standpoint. If it even got you a result, doesn't necessarily mean that the general principles of programming are not valid. The other thing too, so for people, and I see kind of a couple common mistakes all the time that self-coach runners make is when it comes to missed or skipped runs. Because we all miss or skip a run, or we probably should for every now and then, right? Unplanned rest days do need to happen every so often. You're not a robot. What I often see is runners will then take their missed days and like mash them together and say, well, I missed my tempo run, so I'm just going to do that during my long run instead. Right. Or I missed my speed workout, but I'm going to do that today, even though I have a big race pace workout tomorrow. And so it's these little things, in running, there's very little that is acute versus chronic in terms of how things affect us. These things just kind of like, add up and add up. And that's a really cool part about how we gain fitness, right? Every single day, we're just getting a little bit more fit. But at the same time, that also means that these detrimental practices can add up day after day after day until one day, snap, like you're done. You tip into overload or burnout, or you tip into overtraining, or like you just, or literally you break. And so, making those kinds of mistakes where, you're mashing together too much high intensity stuff without appropriate recovery. You're not understanding that you can't just like take your track workout and like put it into your long run. That's crazy. Please don't do that. Right. It's okay to just skip a run and move on.
It's also
And so those
okay
are
to
kind of,
like
yeah.
skip a speed session day. Like I find that people will
Yes.
always drop an easy run. They'll never drop
Mhm.
a workout. So like
Right.
maybe what would have been better in that scenario is to, just skip the workout for that week or one of the workouts for that week and keep the easy session and have that be sort of the makeup day or whatever you're doing. But people tend to want to, because even though we understand the benefit of easy running, we're also really easy to be like,
Yeah, we think that the stuff that really counts is the hard
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And it is the totality of everything and how it comes together. Like, and I'll, for some, obviously you just having had your babies, and anybody who has been pregnant or has kids understands that it's not any one single day in the pregnancy that like makes your child. It's all of the days. And like, yeah, on some of the days they were growing eyeballs, and on some of the days they were growing bones, and on some of the days they were growing brains. But like, you need every single one of those days, right? And it all counts. So yeah, it's the same thing with training. It's not about any one individual specific thing that happened on any one specific day, but it's about the totality of the work you are putting in over the course of not just your training cycle, but like the training cycles that you are linking together over the course of your running career.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. And yes, and like same thing, if we're talking about eating, right? Is like it's not that one salad that you had that one time or that one chocolate bar that you had that one time. Like it's the big picture, the overall habits, the day after day. It's like it's the drudgery of
Yeah,
it that
it
all kind of
is.
accumulates to seeing the changes that we want. But because you said it before, like people want the result in 3 weeks, that we want to rush that process. So we want to do like the hard stuff, the fast stuff, the intense stuff, the things that really make us feel like we're doing something, when it's actually the complete opposite.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the boring stuff that actually
Yeah.
moves the needle. And I
Mm-hmm.
think something we don't often talk about enough is that endurance, being an endurance athlete, you're going to do a lot of the same stuff over and over and you never graduate from easy running. You're going to be running easy effort runs for the rest of your life. It just depends
Yeah.
on, the pace might change depending on how you evolve, right? Yeah, there is a lot of monotony that goes into this. There is. It's a fact. And if that's not something that you jives with who you are, then to be honest with you, this sport might not be for you. Now, I'm not just saying you have to go and like love every single boring easy run that you ever go on, but at the same time, that you have to accept that with all of the goals that you have, there comes a certain amount of like, you just got to put the work in. And sometimes the work is really freaking boring.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's such a great point. And like, I think especially because we live in this sort of social media era where we just are exposed and seeing what everyone else is doing, and things like getting a medal at the end of a race is a very like beautiful thing to be able to highlight on social media. And I mean, we all do it, right? So I think that is what makes people get into racing, because they feel like it's a should, not a want. And then if you don't kind of have that like really strong inner motivation and that really strong like why am I running this marathon? Why did I sign up for this race? Like if you don't have
Yeah.
that sense, then I think that you are going to be more prone to really struggling through and not enjoying the process, because you're not doing it for yourself. You're not maybe doing it for, I'll say, those right reasons. So if you are someone who's listening to this and you haven't enjoyed the process of training, maybe it's just a mindset shift that you need to like get comfortable with the slow running and know that it's not a waste of time. We're not making you do it because we want you to be bored and hate your life and, have no other hobbies or activities outside of running. But there is tremendous value in getting faster by spending that time in that easy zone and doing just that boring stuff. But if even with that, you still are like, no, you know what? This sucks and I hate it. Cool. Do something else.
Yeah. And I also think the expectation of what you're hoping to get out of it. Again, going back to coaching and helping people see and celebrate their progress and the wins and the things they're accomplishing, even things that are absolutely not pace related. Something I work on a lot with my athletes is working on their comfort, their comfort level with trusting themselves when they're pacing things, right?
Mm,
Building that inner
mhm.
confidence and like being able to go execute a workout. And maybe it's not the fastest workout you've ever done, but you nailed it because you knew how to execute it and you trusted yourself about when to push and when to back off. And you felt just really comfortable and strong throughout the whole thing. So like those types of things, the race day, the end of it, is what it's going to be, right? We can't control every single variable. And some days it just doesn't happen. But if the only thing that you're focusing on in terms of how you measure success or failure is what the time is when you cross that finish line, you're missing out on all of the other stuff, which is actually the important part.
Yes, yes. I actually just last week, and his episode will be coming out probably a few weeks before this one. So it will be before this, so you guys will know what I'm talking about before you hear this episode. But I just had interviewed a guy named Dave Proctor, and he's currently the record holder for the fastest run across Canada. And one of the things that he said during that interview that I thought was just like really cool, and I will definitely try to like to my mindset when I'm running, because I mean this guy ran 105 kilometers every single day for 66 and a half days, or
Oh my
whatever the
gosh.
exact time. Like mind blowing, right? He said like you want to run with that mindset of like never wanting that run, any individual run, never wanting it to be over, never wanting it to end. Like that's a tall order. Like, I don't think we all
Yeah.
can like do that every single day. There's this level of zen that I really appreciated from that conversation. But if you're always going into it with the like, oh, when is this going to be over, or kind of like
Yeah.
slogging through those miles, and that sort of the mentality, then yeah, like you're not getting the enjoyment out of it that you could. Like there's this whole like level of just appreciation and enjoyment of the process of training, getting ready for the race. But if it's all just about, especially crossing the finish line at a certain time, like unfortunately, you're probably going to wind up more disappointed than not.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
like, how often do we
And
really get that PR?
And I mean, I don't know about you, but I've done this and I've worked with so many runners who have gotten a PR, like smashed their A goal, massive PR, and will look at me and say, I probably could have run faster if I hadn't done X, Y, and Z in the race. And I'm like, okay, hold on.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, okay, wow, what would we have to accomplish for you to not nitpick your performance, right?
yes,
Like,
yes,
can't we just, appreciate and celebrate rather than humans, we have a negativity bias. It keeps us alive, right? Keeps us aware of danger and don't eat the
yeah,
poison berries sort of thing. But at the same time, like when is enough enough? Right?
yep,
Like yes, you can always want to continue to improve and strive to get better. But if you're not going to take a millisecond to celebrate all the things you did accomplish and go immediately to starting to nitpick and unravel and like, wow, then we got a lot of work to do.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, that is a wonderful place to leave it with some words of wisdom from Elisabeth. Yeah, so I wanna say thank you, and how much I appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge and everything with us, so that people, I think really gain a deeper understanding of like where we're coming from as coaches a lot of the time, and like why you do see sometimes things that are very like heavily debated in the running and nutrition space, and like why are some things such kind of hot topics and stuff like that. Just having a deeper understanding of all that, I felt like having this conversation with someone would be far more engaging than me just talking on my own about it, and I think we nailed it. Yes, thank you so much, Elisabeth. And of course, let all of our listeners know where they can find you, follow you, connect with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steph. I love talking to you. We probably could have, done a 3-hour episode. Yes, you can find me at Running Explained on Instagram, on runningexplained.com, the Running Explained podcast, Running Explained. That's where we are. And, the one thing I'll also say about all of this is that, you know, it, I think sometimes when we embark on a journey with a goal at the end of it, or a goal that's a part of it, it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that the process is the point, right? The journey is the goal. Like the real journey was the friends we made along the way. Like, yeah, the real journey was you got to know yourself better. And having gone through training cycles where you are more trusting and less trusting of you, this whole process becomes so much more enjoyable, no matter what your goal is, when you are doing it, from an internal place that is coming from knowledge and curiosity and learning how to trust yourself, rather than trying to like fight your body and ignore what it's saying and just do it anyways, because life is too short to do things that make you miserable.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this week's episode of the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast. It was a pleasure recording it for you, and we will see you right back here next week. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.